snow fell softly that morning, the kind that muted sound and softened edges, as if the world itself were trying to forget what day it was. Christmas, 1863. A small southern town rested beneath a pale winter sky, chimneys breathing out thin columns of smoke, church windows glowing faintly in the early light. Bells rang slowly, deliberately, calling the faithful to worship. Their sound carried across frozen streets, across shuttered shops and quiet homes, and into the open square where something else was being prepared. Wooden boards had been raised during the night, rough, hastily nailed, still smelling of sap and damp pine. The platform stood just far enough from the church to avoid attention, but close enough that the hymns would drift over it anyway. A wreath hung nearby, its red ribbon stiff with frost. Someone had thought to decorate. Someone had thought it appropriate. By mid-morning, people gathered. Not crowds, nothing dramatic. Just men in heavy coats, boots crunching against packed snow, hands tucked into pockets. A few women stood at a distance, watching without looking. Children passed through on their way to church, guided quickly along, told not to stare. 12 children were brought forward. They did not arrive together. That would have drawn notice. Instead, they came in pairs and threes, led quietly from a nearby holding shed, their breath visible in the cold. Some were old enough to understand exactly where they were. Others only knew that today felt wrong. The oldest was 16. His shoulders already bore the posture of labor, his face set in a way that suggested he had learned not to ask questions that would never be answered. The youngest could not have been more than 6. She clutched a scrap of cloth in her fist, the edge of a dress that no longer fit her properly. Frost gathered in her hair. They were arranged in a line, boots and bare feet alike, resting on the frozen boards. No one told them where to stand. They already knew. Church bells rang again. From somewhere nearby, a choir's voices rose soft at first, then stronger. "Joy to the world," they sang, the notes floating across the square, settling uneasily among the men who had come to buy. The children did not sing. Some of them searched the crowd instinctively, eyes darting, looking for faces they recognized, mothers, fathers, older siblings. A few familiar figures stood at the edges, forbidden from coming closer. They were not allowed to speak. They were not allowed to intervene. They watched in silence, hands clasped, lips pressed tight enough to draw blood. The auctioneer stepped forward. He wore gloves, clean and well kept. His breath fogged as he spoke, voice steady, practiced. This was not his first sale. It was not his last. He did not mention Christmas. He began with age, strength, health. Words chosen carefully, stripped of anything that resembled humanity. The children became measurements, possibilities, investments. One child was asked to turn around slowly. Another was told to open his mouth so teeth could be inspected. The youngest did not understand the instruction and was turned gently by the man behind her, repositioned like an object being displayed. The first sale happened quickly. A boy of 10, quiet, alert. He did not cry when the gavel came down. He only looked once to his left, where a girl, his sister, stood frozen, her hand half raised as if she had almost reached for him. Then he was led away, boots slipping slightly on the snow, swallowed into the crowd. No one clapped. There was no reaction at all. The second sale took longer. The buyers debated value. War had made money uncertain. Futures were fragile. The child stood there while men discussed him as if he were already absent. The bells rang again. As the morning wore on, the line grew shorter. Each sale left behind a gap that felt wider than it was. The remaining children shifted closer together, instinctively, drawn by fear, by cold, by the knowledge that separation was coming, whether they moved or not. When siblings were sold apart, something in the air changed. Not outrage, discomfort. The kind people feel when something inconvenient interrupts routine. One man cleared his throat. Another looked away toward the church, where the hymn had shifted now, slower, more reverent. A girl screamed when her brother was pulled from her grasp. It was sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. For a moment, the auctioneer hesitated. Just a moment. Then he continued, voice raised slightly to cover the sound, as if volume alone could restore order. By afternoon, the snow had thickened. Wagons waited at the edges of the square, drivers stamping their feet, reins held loosely. Each purchase was escorted away immediately. No lingering, no last looks. The man who owned them stood apart from it all. He did not bargain. He did not speak. He watched. Well-dressed, composed, known in town as a respectable figure, a man who donated to the church, a man who believed himself moral. He told himself he was being practical. The war had changed everything. Emancipation loomed like a threat, not a promise. Better to sell now than lose everything later. Better to be decisive. He did not look at the children directly. He looked at the ledger in his hand. Columns, numbers, ink that did not tremble. As the sun dipped lower, the final child remained. She was small, uncertain, her feet numb, her breath shallow. The crowd hesitated now not from mercy, but from calculation. A child so young meant years of expense before labor returned value. The bidding was slower, the silence longer. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed unnaturally loud. By sunset, the platform stood empty. Snow began to erase the footprints. The wreath sagged slightly under the weight of ice. The town returned to Christmas. Lights glowed in windows. Laughter spilled from doorways. Plates were filled. Prayers were said. Somewhere beyond the square, 12 lives were being carried away, unrecorded, unremembered by anything official enough to matter. And the man who sold them walked home alone, truly believing, that what he had done would end with the day. It did not. He was known in town as a solid man. Not beloved, not feared, respected. The kind of respect that grows quietly over years, built from punctual church attendance, regular donations, and a careful distance from scandal. His name appeared on committees, on subscription lists, on plaques that thanked benefactors for their generosity. He sat in the same pew every Sunday. He bowed his head at the right moments. He shook hands firmly and spoke little dot to those who knew him only in public. He represented stability in an unstable time, but stability in 1863 was already an illusion. The war had tightened its grip on the South. Trade routes collapsed. Confederate currency weakened by the month. Rumors traveled faster than soldiers' rumors of Union advances, of plantations seized, of enslaved people fleeing whenever blue uniforms appeared on the horizon. Even those far from the front felt it. The future was no longer guaranteed. He felt it keenly. His land was still productive, but margins were shrinking. Creditors had begun to ask questions. Neighbors whispered about emancipation, as if it were a storm cloud distant, but coming. He told himself he was not afraid of change. He told himself he was adapting dot in private. His calculations were ruthless. The children had value now. In a year, perhaps none. Selling them was not cruelty in his mind, it was foresight. He framed it as necessity, a harsh choice forced by harsher times. The language mattered to him. He never said, children. He said, assets. He never said, sale. He said, transfer. This was how he slept at night, that those who worked closest to him knew a different version of the man. Not overtly violent, not prone to rage. Instead, cold, exacting. Silence used as punishment more often than the lash. Expectations communicated without warmth, enforced without discussion. He believed order was moral. He believed hierarchy was natural dot, and above all, he believed himself separate from the suffering that supported his life. On the morning of the sale, he dressed carefully. Dark coat, clean boots. A pocket watch polished until it reflected his face back at him, composed, controlled. He ate little. Appetite was inconvenient. Emotion even more so. He did not escort the children to the square. He had others for that. Distance preserved dignity. Distance allowed him to think of the day as a transaction rather than an event. At the auction, he stood just far enough away to avoid conversation. He did not look directly at the platform. He watched the crowd instead, watched bids rise and fall, watched money change hands. Each sale brought a quiet sense of relief. Not pleasure relief, like shedding weight before a long journey. When it was over, he closed the ledger slowly, methodically, each page accounted for, each figure final. What he did not account for was himself, because beneath the rationalizations, beneath the careful language and moral bookkeeping, something else stirred. Not guilt, not yet. Something closer to irritation. A sense that the day had taken more from him than he expected. That despite his logic, the air felt heavier. The cold sharper. He dismissed it immediately. Men like him had survived worse than discomfort. He walked home that evening, convinced of one thing above all others, that history would understand him. That if anyone ever questioned the choice, context would absolve him. War excused many things. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that history would remember him, not for what he believed justified, but for what followed. And that the night ahead would strip away every story he told himself. One by one, the platform had been cleared and rebuilt before dawn. Boards still damp from frost, nails hammered in with hurried precision. By the time the first buyers arrived, it looked ordinary enough, just another temporary structure meant to serve a purpose and then disappear. No marker, no sign, nothing to suggest that by nightfall it would already feel like a place people wanted to forget. The auctioneer began his work without ceremony. He did not announce the date. He did not acknowledge the holiday. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone accustomed to speaking over discomfort. Each phrase was neutral, transactional, designed to keep emotion from slowing the process. The children were brought forward and arranged as instructed. Some stood stiffly, bracing themselves against the cold. Others swayed slightly, unsure where to place their feet. They were told to face the crowd. They obeyed. Buyers stepped closer, boots scraping against wood and ice. They examined hands, shoulders, posture. Questions were asked and answered as if discussing livestock. A child's age was corrected. Another's health was assured. Someone laughed briefly at a private remark, then stopped when no one joined in. The first separation happened quietly. A handoff. A nod. The boy was guided away, not roughly, just firmly enough that resistance felt pointless. He looked back once, then did not look again. After that, the rhythm settled in. The gavel rose and fell. Names, when spoken at all, were mispronounced and abandoned entirely. Siblings were sold in different lots because grouping reduced profit. Mothers, watching from a distance, lowered their eyes when it happened, not because it hurt less, but because watching did nothing to stop it. Christmas decorations framed the scene in cruel contrast. A strip of greenery hung from a nearby post. Red ribbon fluttered weakly in the wind. Snowflakes landed on shoulders and hair, melting slowly, unnoticed. As the day wore on, buyers grew more efficient. Fewer questions. Faster bids. Time mattered now. Dinners waited. Families expected them home. One man crossed himself after completing a purchase. Another remarked that the roads would freeze hard by nightfall. These were ordinary conversations, exchanged over extraordinary suffering. The auctioneer paused only once, when a girl cried out after being pulled from her sister's side. The sound cut through the square sharply enough to draw stares. For a brief moment, the crowd shifted uneasily. Then someone bid. The gavel fell. Order resumed. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the boards. Only one child remained. The youngest. She stood alone now, the space around her wide and exposed. She did not cry. She did not speak. She watched the adults with an expression that suggested she was trying to understand something far beyond her reach. The bidding slowed. Calculations replaced urgency. A child so young meant delay before profit. The auctioneer adjusted his pitch. Finally, a hand went up. Then another. The price settled lower than the rest. When the gavel struck for the last time, the sound echoed across the square, louder than before, as if the empty air amplified it. By sunset, the platform was deserted. Wagons rolled away. Footprints filled with snow. The wreath sagged, heavy with ice. The town turned back to celebration. And somewhere beyond the square, 12 children disappeared into records that would never follow them again. Night settled slowly, as it often does after snowfall, with a silence that felt deliberate. Sound did not travel far. Footsteps were muffled. Doors closed softly. Lamps glowed behind curtains. Their light diffused into warm halos that made the cold seem distant, manageable. The town exhaled, relieved to return to what it told itself was normal. Inside homes, tables were set. Plates were passed. Children recited memorized verses, their voices uneven but earnest. Prayers were spoken aloud, thanks for safety, for food, for another year survived in uncertain times. Outside, the church bells rang once more. Marking the close of the day, the man who had owned the children walked. Home alone. His house stood slightly apart from the others, large without being ostentatious. 2 stories. Broad porch. Tall windows that reflected the snow like dark mirrors. It was the kind of home meant to project permanence, stability, the reassurance that some things endured no matter how violently the world changed. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, closing it carefully behind him. The interior was warm, but not welcoming. Furniture arranged with intention, not comfort. Walls decorated sparsely. The air carried the faint smell of wood smoke and polish. A fire burned low in the hearth, its light throwing slow shadows across the room. He removed his coat and gloves, hanging them neatly. Habit mattered. Order mattered. He poured himself a drink, measured and deliberate, and sat in his chair near the fire. For the first time that day, there was no one watching. He told himself it was over, that the day had passed, that tomorrow would bring the same routines it always had. The ledger rested where he had placed it, closed, its weight familiar and reassuring. Numbers balanced. Accounts settled. He raised the glass, took a sip, and exhaled. That was when he heard it, a sound so faint at first that it barely registered. A soft, hollow knock, somewhere beyond the walls. He paused, listening. The fire crackled. The house creaked as it always did when settling. He waited for the sound to repeat. It did. 3 knocks, slow, evenly spaced. He frowned and stood, setting the glass aside. Visitors were unlikely at this hour, especially on Christmas night. Still, he moved toward the door, irritation rising more than concern. He opened it. The porch was empty. Snow lay undisturbed. No footprints. No movement. The cold rushed in briefly, sharp and immediate, before he closed the door again. He stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. He told himself it was the wood contracting in the cold. Old houses make noise. He had lived here long enough to know that. Turning back toward the room, something near the threshold caught his eye. A small shoe lay in the snow. Just beyond the door. It was worn, child-sized. The leather cracked along the side, the sole thin from use. He stared at it longer than he intended to, his mind searching for explanation. A neighbor's child, perhaps. A prank. Someone careless. He stepped outside again, scanning the darkness. Still nothing. No tracks leading away. No sign of how it had arrived there at all. He picked up the shoe. It was cold, stiff with frost. For the first time that night, something unsettled stirred beneath his certainty. Not fear yet, but a discomfort he could not place. He brought the shoe inside and set it on the table, telling himself he would return it in the morning. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, he heard a sound that did not belong to wood or fire or wind, a faint whisper, and then another dot at first. He thought the sound came from outside. Wind slipping through gaps in the frame. Snow brushing against shutters. He stood still, holding his breath, listening closely, waiting for the house to explain itself the way it always had. But the whispers did not fade. They shifted. They moved. Not through the air, but through the walls themselves, sliding along beams and floors as if the house were hollowed out for sound alone. Soft at first, barely distinguishable from one another, too faint to carry words. Just breath and cadence, a suggestion of voices where no voices should be. He took a step back toward the fire. The flames flickered suddenly, dimming, though no draft touched them. The room felt colder. Not the honest cold of winter air, but something deeper, heavier, pressing inward. The whispers grew clearer. A child's laugh, short and uncertain, followed by another sound that might have been a sob. Then silence. Then a scraping noise from above, slow and deliberate, as though something small were being dragged across the floor of the upper rooms. His heart began to beat faster. He told himself there were explanations. Houses carried noise in strange ways. Memory had a way of intruding when one was tired. He had been awake since before dawn. He had drunk more than usual. He reached for the clock on the mantel. It had stopped. The hands were frozen between hours, unmoving despite the steady ticking he knew should have been there. He wound it once, twice, nothing. He struck it gently against the wood. Still nothing. From behind the walls, a voice whispered clearly now, not words. A sound like counting. Slow, careful, as if someone were keeping track. He backed away, his heel catching on the rug. Shadows along the far wall stretched and shifted, no longer matching the movement of the fire. One grew longer than the others, thinning into the shape of a small figure, before dissolving again. Enough, he said aloud, his voice sharper than he intended. The sound of it seemed to disturb the room, as if the house itself had been listening. The whispers paused, then resumed, closer now. They came from beneath the floorboards, from behind the fireplace, from the ceiling above his head. Everywhere at once, layered and overlapping, rising and falling in a rhythm that made his skin prickle. He moved toward the staircase, placing a hand on the banister. It felt colder than it should have, the wood biting into his palm. As he lifted his foot to take the first step, a sound rose beneath him, a low, hollow thump. Like something pressing upward from below. He froze. A child's voice spoke, soft but unmistakable. Directly behind him, he turned. The room was empty. The fire sputtered and went out completely, plunging the house into a dim, flickering half-light cast only by distant lamps. In that weak glow, he saw faint marks forming on the walls. Not stains. Not cracks. Handprints. Small. Pale, pressed from the inside outward. He staggered back, breath coming fast now, denial giving way to something sharper and more dangerous. He thought of prayer then, fleetingly, the way one thinks of a tool long unused and no longer trusted. He did not speak the words. The whispers grew louder, no longer content to hide. And somewhere within them, he recognized something he had not expected to hear at all. His own voice, repeating phrases he had spoken that morning. Business. Not cruelty. Necessary. Better now than later. The house remembered, and it was not finished speaking. The voices multiplied, layering over each other, indistinguishable, yet unmistakably human. Whispers became murmurs, murmurs became words, words became sentences. Each one cut sharper than any lash could. They spoke of cold hands, of hunger, of tears shed silently while the snow fell outside. They spoke of small bodies lined on rough boards, of siblings torn apart, of the youngest clutching a scrap of cloth and staring at a world that had no mercy for her. He pressed his hands against his ears, stumbling back toward the fireplace, but the sounds came from everywhere. Beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, from the ceiling above. Shadows moved in unnatural ways, coiling and stretching, separating from the weak light of the hearth, then returning as if testing him. One shadow grew taller, thin and trembling, then split into several smaller forms that hovered at the edges of his vision. He tried to convince himself it was exhaustion. The day had been long, taxing. A full ledger balanced, 12 children sold, the day's work complete. That was all it could be. And yet, the instinctive horror in his chest would not allow him to breathe easily. Something else was happening, something alive, something waiting. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, but the sound was unnatural, echoing beneath him as if something moved independently beneath the wood. Then came a faint scraping, deliberate and soft, like fingernails against boards. He froze, listening, his pulse hammering. He wanted to run, but could not. Something kept him rooted. Not fear exactly, but understanding. Understanding that this house, this night, remembered. That the ledger, the children, the sale, none of it had gone unnoticed. A single voice rose above the rest, clear, innocent, a child. Why? It asked. No anger, no accusation, just the raw, haunting simplicity of a question a child should never have to ask. He could not answer. Words lodged in his throat. Breath trembled. The room contracted, shadows pressing closer, whispering together in a chorus that demanded attention. He reached for the ledger, as if holding it could somehow restore control, could somehow rewrite the day, undo what had been done. The book was closed. He opened it. The ink had darkened, changed, bleeding along the lines. Numbers were replaced with letters. Names replaced with words he did not recognize at first. Then he realized they were accusations. Descriptions of what had been taken from each child. Years of fear, of hunger, of cold, of loss. He dropped it, stepping back as though the paper itself had struck him. The shadows advanced, slow and deliberate, moving toward him without speed, without sound, carrying with them the weight of every life he had disrupted. He tried to command them, to tell them to leave, to obey, but the shadows ignored him. They were not children to be controlled, not property to be ordered. They were memory given form, grief made corporeal, justice in the shape of whispers and silhouettes. He stumbled toward the staircase, hoping to reach the upper rooms, hoping for some refuge, some corner where the sound could not follow. But as he reached the first step, the temperature dropped sharply. Frost gathered along the banister, sharp and biting. He could see his breath swirl before him, even though the hearth had once been warm. The steps beneath his feet felt unstable, shifting ever so slightly, as if the house itself were conscious, unwilling to allow him upward. A voice, small and clear, spoke from the shadows just behind him. "You sold us." It was a child's voice. Not loud, not angry, just a statement of fact. Every whisper that followed was a repetition of his own justifications, now reflected back at him. Business, not cruelty, better now than later, necessary. Words that had comforted him now became nails in the coffin of his mind. Panic finally overcame the careful composure he had maintained all day. He turned in a circle, trying to escape, trying to find a door, a window, some break in the walls. But every corner, every doorway, every window was either empty or filled with a shadow that should not exist. Filled with tiny hands pressed against invisible glass, eyes that glowed faintly, accusing. Waiting. The house had become a living record of his deeds. Not a place of punishment as one might expect, but a place of remembrance. The whispers were the ledger he could not close, the cries he could not ignore, the memory of innocence lost that would not allow him to forget. And in that moment, he understood. This night was not an accident. It was a reckoning. He staggered backward, heart hammering, mind grasping for reason in a world that had none. The whispers condensed into shapes, shadows twisting into forms he could almost recognize. First one, then another, until the room seemed crowded with small figures, standing where there had been none. The firelight flickered over faces he should have remembered, but didn't. Each child reflected a moment from that day, the tilt of a head, the tremble of a hand, the fleeting fear in wide eyes. They were not violent. They did not scream. They simply watched, still and accusing, the quiet weight of what he had done pressing down upon him. He tried to speak, tried to command them as he might a servant. "Go," he shouted, voice cracking. "Leave this house." The shadows did not move. Their eyes followed him, unwavering. One small figure stepped forward, shaking its head slowly. The others mirrored the motion, a silent chorus of refusal. He realized with a jolt that they were not here to obey. They were here to remember. Time fractured. Minutes stretched impossibly long, then snapped forward, leaving him disoriented. He stumbled toward the door, pulled at the handle, tried windows, each sealed by frost that had formed impossibly fast. The house no longer obeyed the natural order. The air grew heavier, colder. He could see his own breath in the dim, wavering light. Snow piled against the door outside as if it had been there for hours. Yet he had barely moved from the hearth. Desperate, he turned back toward the room. Shadows had multiplied. More faces appeared in corners, in reflections, in the firelight. Some were familiar siblings he had sold together, now separated. Some were alone, staring at him with silent accusation. He noticed one detail that made his stomach tighten. The youngest girl, the one who had been last to sell, stood closest to him, her eyes the brightest in the dim room. She was small, fragile, yet her presence carried authority. She did not speak, yet he felt her understanding him better than he understood himself. His gaze fell to the ledger on the table. The ink was no longer black, nor simply faded. It was a deep crimson that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. He approached it hesitantly, knowing what he would find before he did. The entries had changed. Names were replaced by descriptions of suffering cold nights, hungry mouths, tears uncomforted. Numbers of sale had become years of fear, each child's life accounted for, in ways he could not calculate, ways no arithmetic could reconcile. He reached to close the book. It slipped through his fingers, landing with a thud that echoed too loudly in the frozen silence. The shadows pressed closer, their forms blurring and coalescing, yet the children's faces remained clear. Not a hint of forgiveness, only awareness. They spoke now not with words, but with presence, and the air itself carried their memory. The cold, the hunger, the fear, the separation. It pressed against his chest, stole his breath, and yet he could not look away. He sank to the floor, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the youngest. Her gaze held something impossible, both accusation and understanding. It was a look that demanded he remember, that forced him to confront what he had chosen. The fire sputtered, then died entirely, plunging him into a half-light that shifted with every whisper, every breath, every remembered sob. The room was no longer a room. It was a ledger of memory, a record of loss, a place where deeds could not be undone, only witnessed. The shadows stirred. One by one, each child moved closer. Their forms solidified, then faded, lingering in corners, in reflections on walls. He could feel their presence in the floor beneath him, in the beams above, in the very air he breathed. He wanted to pray, to call for mercy, to speak to God, but the words would not form. He had spent a lifetime rationalizing cruelty. Now rationality was useless. All that remained was the quiet weight of consequence. And then the whispers spoke in unison, softly, steadily, as if counting each moment he had overlooked. Do you remember? Each syllable pressed like cold steel against his chest. He realized, in the absolute clarity of fear, that the house, the shadows, the children, they were all the ledger, all the record, all the judgment. There would be no escape. Not from them. Not from what he had done. Not from himself. He could no longer move. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but the house refused. Doors that had opened freely before now held fast, windows sealed with frost, the locks unyielding. The fire had gone out, leaving only shadows that moved independently of the flickering lamplight. The room felt alive, breathing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. As if the house itself were a beast waiting for him to falter, he sank to his knees, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the table where the ledger had landed. Crimson ink now spread across the pages, dark and wet, shimmering in the dim light. The names of the children he had sold were gone, replaced by descriptions of suffering he could scarcely bear to read. Cold nights, hunger, broken bonds, tears unshun all, catalogued meticulously, as though the ledger itself remembered every moment of his cruelty. Prices he had demanded for their bodies were gone. In their place, numbers that felt infinite, representing years of pain, fear, and loss. He reached to close the book, but the pages flipped of their own accord. Ink dripped like blood, each word forming, then fading, then forming again. He could hear soft scratching noises, like tiny fingers moving across paper, the whispers rising to a chorus of accusation. Each child's memory pressed into his mind with unbearable clarity. He saw the boy who had been sold first, alone in a wagon, shoulders slumping. The girl who had cried when her brother was torn away. The youngest, clutching her scrap of cloth, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Enough! He shouted, voice cracking, but the sound seemed swallowed by the room itself. The ledger continued its work. Pages turned. Ink bled. Shadows moved closer, circling him, forming a living barrier he could not breach. His rationalizations, business, necessity, survival were repeated back to him in whispers, distorted and hollow, a cruel echo of his own self-justifications. Each phrase that had comforted him now became a nail, each rational thought a reminder of what he had taken from others. He tried to rise, to escape, but the floor seemed to shift beneath him. Frost spread across the boards, climbing his legs like creeping vines. Time distorted. Hours stretched impossibly, minutes collapsing into seconds. The air grew thick with the weight of remembered suffering. He felt the children all around him, not reaching out violently, but present in every shadow, in every breath of wind through the house, in the faintest creak of the beams. A whisper rose above the others, small and clear, unmistakably human. "Do you see us?" The voice was soft, almost innocent, yet it carried the unbearable gravity of truth. He could not answer. Words failed him. His throat constricted, lungs burning with each attempt to draw breath. He realized then that there would be no reprieve, no distraction, no rationalization, no sleep. The ledger, the house, the shadows, they were all the same. All memory, all judgment, all reckoning. The fire sputtered once more, flaring briefly, revealing their faces in half-light. One by one, each child appeared fully, stepping from the shadows. Not as specters of rage, but as witnesses, as reflections of what he had done. The youngest stood closest, her gaze fixed on him, accusing yet incomprehensibly calm. He understood finally that their presence was the price of his choices. He had believed he could sell them without consequence, that distance, money, and time would absolve him. But here, in this room, no illusion remained. Tears ran down his face, mingling with sweat. He could not pray, could not call for forgiveness. His voice, when it came, was raw and broken. "I am sorry," he whispered, over and over, until the words lost meaning. The whispers responded, repeating his justifications back to him, stripping them of comfort, twisting them into confession he could not escape. He sank fully to the floor, clutching his head, aware of every small presence pressing toward him, of every memory of suffering catalogued and remembered. The ledger turned another page on its own, the ink forming a single word across the top. Enough. The shadows drew closer, until the children surrounded him completely. Silence fell. Not peace, but the unbearable stillness of a world fully aware of every misdeed. He realized with absolute certainty that he would not leave this house in the same state he had entered it, that the reckoning had begun, and it would last as long as the night or longer. He lifted his head slowly, eyes brimming with tears, voice trembling even as he tried to speak. I am sorry," he whispered over and over, until the sound seemed to echo from every wall, every corner, every beam of the house. His apologies were small, fragile things, carried into the shadows that pressed closer, but they found no purchase. The children did not react as children might. They did not smile. They did not forgive. They only observed, their eyes reflecting every sorrow, every betrayal, every instant of fear he had inflicted. Then one voice spoke. A single child, the youngest, the one he had sold last, whose small frame had seemed so fragile on the auction block. Why? The word carried no malice, no anger. It was a simple, pure question that pierced deeper than any accusation. It was a question that demanded truth. He could not answer. No words could undo what had been done. No promises could erase the ledger of suffering that the house itself now kept out. Another voice, slightly older, chimed in, recounting a detail of their lives after the sale. He could see their small forms in his mind, the boy who had been sold to a farmer far away, forced to work through nights of hunger, the girl taken from her sister, crying silently into the cold darkness of a stranger's house. The whispers grew clearer, and he realized they were not merely sounds, they were memories, lived and recorded, pressing in from every corner of the room. He tried to rise, to command them as he had once commanded property, as he had expected obedience from human beings, reduced to objects. "Leave," he cried. "Obey me." But the words fell flat, powerless. The children's forms did not move, did not obey, did not react to fear or anger. They existed outside his control, beyond his authority. Their accusation was simple and absolute. He had done this to them, and there was no justification that mattered anymore. The room grew colder, frost creeping along the floorboards, wrapping his ankles in icy chains. The shadows flickered and lengthened, coalescing into forms that were smaller than adults, but larger than children, visions of all the lives disrupted, each bearing the weight of memory and grief. The ledger on the table opened itself again, pages flipping rapidly. The ink, still dark and wet like fresh blood, reshaped itself into words he could not ignore. Names were gone, replaced by what he had done: fear, hunger, sorrow, separation. Numbers of sale had become years of suffering. Each child's fate written in the ledger now bore witness to his actions more accurately than he could ever record in his own mind. He fell to his knees, sobbing, hands covering his face. His rationalizations, business, necessity, practicality, echoed mockingly from the shadows, repeated in voices he had once believed were safe. He had sold them, he told himself, to survive, to protect his estate, to keep order. But every word he had spoken that morning came back to him twisted, amplified, undeniable. There was no rationalization now, only memory and accusation. Then, impossibly, one child stepped forward from the shadows. The smallest girl, eyes wide and calm. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but the effect was unbearable. "I forgive you," she said. And the room froze. Not in relief, not in comfort, but in a kind of horror that shattered every expectation. Forgiveness from the innocent was the weightiest judgment of all, a truth he could not bear. Her gaze held him in place, and in that gaze he understood the depth of his crime and the futility of escape. The whispers subsided, leaving only the presence of the children, circling, observing. The air became heavy with silence, pressing in on him. The fire remained out, the frost thick against the walls, the ledger open and still rewriting itself with every heartbeat of memory he could no longer suppress. He was no longer master of anything, not the house, not the ledger, not even himself. He realized, with a clarity that crushed him, that he had become the property of memory. Not in chains he could see or feel, but in a captivity far worse, a perpetual reckoning that would not end, a judgment that would not forgive, a silence heavier than any noise. The house itself had become an auction block, and he was the item examined, priced, and found wanting. Morning came slowly, gray and muted, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise over the snow-covered town. Church bells rang in the distance, carrying across the empty streets, marking the usual start of Christmas Day. Neighbors emerged from their homes, blinking against the cold light, expecting the normal rhythms of a holiday morning. Children laughing, families gathering, the smell of fires and breakfast drifting through the crisp air. But one house remained silent. The windows were dark. No smoke rose from the chimney. The door, slightly ajar, revealed nothing but an empty hallway, frozen and still. Those who approached later would remark on how the snow lay untouched, except for the bare footprints leading inside footprints that began at the door and stopped at the center of the parlor. No one had left the house that night. When the authorities were finally called, neighbors citing concern over the absence of light and movement, they found him on the floor near the hearth. His body was still rigid, his expression frozen in terror. No marks marred the skin. No weapon, no wound, no sign of struggle. Just the memory of the night etched into his features. The horror of what he had witnessed preserved in a permanent gaze. The children's shoe lay by the door, small and warm, untouched by the snow that had settled thickly around it. It was the only tangible evidence of the previous day's atrocities, and it spoke louder than any ledger or record could. Investigators noted the strangeness of the scene, but quickly wrote it off as natural causes. A heart stopped by stress, perhaps, or a sudden illness exacerbated by winter's chill. They removed the ledger missing when the house was later sold, perhaps believing it contained nothing more than mundane accounts of commerce. The house itself became a cautionary tale whispered among the townsfolk. Future occupants reported noises, soft footsteps pacing in empty rooms, faint laughter followed by crying, doors that locked on their own, fires that extinguished without reason. Some swore they saw small figures moving behind curtained windows, glimpses of faces pressed against the glass that vanished when approached. The house was eventually abandoned, left to decay, a relic of a night that refused to fade. The children disappeared into history. their fates obscured by the chaos of war and the indifference of bureaucracy. Buyers' names scratched from records, families unable to reclaim them, freedom coming too late to matter. All that remained were rumors, fragmented letters, church records hinting at their existence, and the single shoe preserved in an archive, an object of unease and fascination. Modern historians examine the events with disbelief tempered by horror. Not merely the supernatural occurrences, which could be dismissed as legend, but the reality of what had happened. A man ordinary in every way, enacting cruelty under the guise of law and necessity, only to be confronted by a reckoning that transcended time, logic, and morality. What terrifies them most is the mundane origin of evil, the fact that it was legal, accepted, and even praised at the time. The haunting, they say, is secondary to the bureaucracy of cruelty. The story lingers in local memory. The house, long gone, survives in photographs, sketches, and accounts that hint at something unresolved. Christmas bells still ring in that town, but for those who remember, the echoes carry a different weight, a reminder that some actions cannot be hidden, that some horrors persist beyond ledger entries, beyond death. Beyond the passing of years, the bells tolled again at Christmas, as they had every year since. Their clear, crisp notes carried across the empty streets, mingling with the wind that whispered through the skeletal remains of buildings long abandoned. To most, the sound was ordinarily a reminder of celebration, of routine, of continuity. But for those who remembered, who had heard the story passed down in fragments, the tolling carried a weight far heavier than mere sound. It was a reminder that some deeds leave an echo that refuses to fade, a resonance that transcends generations. The house itself was gone now, reduced to rubble, or perhaps claimed by time and neglect. Yet the memory of it persisted. Windows that had once reflected snow now reflected only history. The ledger, missing from its place on the hearth, existed only in stories, fragments of accounts, rumors preserved in church records, and the single shoe carefully kept in an archive. A silent witness to innocence sold and terror received. Historians speak of the man with incredulity. They describe him as ordinary, a figure who attended church, contributed to charity, maintained appearances, and yet committed a monstrous act under the guise of legality. It is the ordinariness that terrifies them, more than any ghost or whispered voice. The haunting, the apparitions, the frost-covered floors, they are secondary to the fact that cruelty was bureaucratic, sanctioned, and normalized. It was human, systemic, ordinary. That realization, they say, chills more than any ghost story ever could. And yet, the narrative is not entirely past. The night he sold 12 children and returned to an empty, cold house lingers. In the silence of the archive, when the shoe rests under glass, when the bell tolls across the town, it is as if something watches, waits, remembers. The ledger may have disappeared, the house may have decayed, the man may have perished, but memory does not yield. Memory is unrelenting, and memory is the true inheritance of those lost children. For the listener, the viewer, the reader, there is a lesson harsher than any ghost story. Evil can exist quietly, under the guise of normalcy. It can be legal, accepted, and even respected by a community. But it leaves a mark. It leaves a ledger. And sometimes, centuries later, it still finds a way to speak out the bell's echo once more. Clear, insistent, a reminder that the past is never buried, that injustice does not vanish, that the ordinary can harbor horrors unimaginable. Somewhere, in the silence between their tolls, one hears the faintest whisper, a child's voice, asking a question that never fades. And so the story ends, not with vengeance, not with fire, but with memory, a quiet, persistent echo that refuses to be ignored. The night is long, the snow unmoved, and the echoes linger, waiting for the next listener, the next witness, the next reckoning. This is the story that historians cannot forget. This is the night that still terrifies.